Compared to the Virtual Console, it's no secret that the Nintendo Switch's online service sucks a horse egg, but I already made an entire video about that on my personal channel, Cameron All One Word. But while there's a lot of reasons why people hate Nintendo's new method of distributing classic games, the biggest complaint by far has to do with the fact that the only games being offered are from the NES and Famicom. Meanwhile, in 2006, the Wii launched with NES, Super Nintendo, and 64 games all on day one. And to make matters worse, the Wii used to drop 2 to 3 new classic games every week that people actually wanted to play, whereas the Switch just keeps offering titles once a month that vary from trash to meh. The most obvious solution to make people happy with the online service's classic games is to at least add Super Nintendo titles to the catalog as soon as possible, which is totally a step in the right direction. But what if you were in charge of which games get put on the service, and for some reason, Nintendo absolutely forbids you from choosing games from anything other than the NES? Would it even be possible to calm the enraged fanbase down, or is adding more consoles the only way to make people happy? Well, if you ask me, I think there's a good handful of NES titles that could at the very least delay the riots. So sit back in your father's YouTube viewing chair, pause the Scott Steiner lectures playing in the other tabs, press the subscribe button to prove you're not a registered sex offender, and allow me, the Captain of Fun Cameron, to tell you 11 NES games that Nintendo could add to the Switch's online service that make the absence of Super Nintendo games a little more bearable. Numbers 1 and 2. Fire Emblem and Fire Emblem Gaiden. If Nintendo's gonna try to act like it's a big deal that they're giving us NES games again, then the least they could do is give us titles we've never played before. After all, if you haven't played it, it's new to you. Even if we're being denied Super Nintendo games for no good reason, it'd be hard to stay mad at Nintendo for too long if they're giving us new NES games. A good chunk of this list is gonna be titles that were never officially translated into English, so with that being said, why not start with Fire Emblem while it's in the peak of its popularity? I'm sure the Famicom app's gonna get the first 2 Fire Emblem games, but unless you can read Japanese, it's just gonna feel like a carrot being dangled in front of you. There's already fan translations for these games that you could illegally download via the internet, but we all know Nintendo would be too stubborn to use those versions since they're wieners about fans modifying their IPs. It's highly unlikely that they'd ever translate old games, but they really should, because first of all, it'd be cool as frig, and second of all, it wouldn't even be hard. I mean, if random-ass people can localize these games in their spare time for free, then there's no way a multi-billion-dollar company can't do it in like 2 weeks tops. Hell, they could even copy the exact dialogue the fans translated and then change the wording slightly so nobody notices. And even if people did notice, I don't think anyone would speak up over it since we'd all just be happy to see official releases for popular games. I know both of these Fire Emblem games have already been remade, and those versions are probably a lot better. But I don't know, I just think it'd be fun to get something you never thought you'd have. And besides, a big part of playing the original versions of games that were remade, or even just NES games in general, is to appreciate the history behind them. I mean, most NES games on the Switch's online service haven't aged well either, so I don't think that's a very good reason to deprive non-Japanese speakers games they never got to play. Besides, even though Super Mario All-Stars and Mario Advance 4 exist, a lot of people still prefer to play the original Mario 3 just because. And I think English-speaking Fire Emblem fans deserve the option to go back to the originals. So Nintendo should stop being jerks and either pay Artemis251 a few bucks to use his or her translation, or just get 2 unpaid interns to translate these games so they could add a little bit more value to the NES catalog. Number 3. Little Samson. This Mega Man clone made by disgruntled Capcom employees actually did come out in North America, but for whatever reason, the game didn't do very well. And since nobody ever bought it and it was never re-released, pictures of broken copies of the game cost like $278,000 on eBay. So unless you're either rich or somewhat aware of obscure NES games to play on an emulator, chances are you probably haven't played this gem. So I'd imagine the majority of English speakers, and really the rest of the world for that matter, probably have no idea what this game is. But if Nintendo were to find the buttwagons who own the rights to this and convince them to make money on it rather than just sit on the IP for no reason, then it could make a pretty big impact on the online service. People who know the game's history would think it's awesome, and the people who don't would be pleasantly surprised at just how good the game really is. In fact, it's actually one of my favorite platformers of all time. Like I said, it's a Mega Man clone made by disgruntled Capcom employees who worked on the original series. But Little Samson's a lot more linear, and rather than acquiring different weapons from beating bosses, you can switch out between 4 characters who all have their own strengths and weaknesses. Parts of it are pretty difficult, but it's nothing that'd make you want to pull your ass hairs out or anything. And besides, with the rewind feature, even my dad's friend Tugboat can make it to the end. Number 4. Coco Rome. This was made by the same people who created Little Samson, but the difference here is that this game never made it outside of Japan. Rather than rotating between 4 different characters, you actually create your own, which is pretty unique for an action platformer. I don't necessarily think it's a good idea, but they did about as good of a job with it as you could. And the game's still more fun than half the games on the online service right now anyway. There is some Japanese text that need to be translated, and since Nintendo would have to secure the rights to this game, it's highly unlikely they'd ever make the effort to add it to their service, especially with it being so obscure. But much like Fire Emblem, fan translations for this game already exist, so they could just homework copy and paste from those translations in like 3 minutes. All I'm saying is that if Nintendo's not willing to go the extra 10 feet, then I don't want to hear them complain when fans dislike the hell out of their video promoting pinball. Number 5. Zombie Nation. This is probably the weirdest NES game ever made, which is why it'd be perfect for the Nintendo Switch. It's a shoot 'em up where you basically fly around as a severed zombie head while trying to save the world by destroying everything in sight. I could probably find a better explanation if I did some digging, but I don't think any explanation's really gonna make this normal anyway, so why bother? All that matters is that this game's as fun as it is high on my neighbor Terry's meth. The game doesn't need to be translated or anything, but the fact that you're playing as a severed head might be a little too mature for Nintendo. But anyone who's been on the internet for like 5 minutes has seen much worse. So if Nintendo wants to make their service cool, hopefully they try to lock this down. That is, if they could secure the rights anyway. Number 6. Famicom Wars. This is another game that needed translation, but for the 800th time, it shouldn't be a problem for a billion-dollar company to force an unpaid intern or two to do it in like 5 minutes. In case you're unaware, these are the predecessors to the Advance Wars series. And in case you don't know what the Advance Wars series, it's basically a strategy game that got popular on the Game Boy Advance. And for some reason, it hasn't been seen since 2008 on the Nintendo DS. It's similar enough to Fire Emblem to feel familiar, yet distinct enough to have its own appeal. Much like Fire Emblem, the original games don't hold up very well on the Famicom. I mean, it's pretty annoying that the CPU takes time to think before making moves. But the game's fun enough to play through that Nintendo should toss it into the mix, especially since most people outside of Japan never touched it. Number 7. Splatterhouse Wanpaku Graffiti. When most people think of Splatterhouse, this is probably what comes to mind right here. But what Splatterhouse fans usually think of is this. But little do people know, the Famicom is a game that can be considered the adopted child of the series that looks and plays nothing like the other games. But that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. Rather than being a beat-em-up with a gritty, badass protagonist, Wanpaku Graffiti is a platformer where you play as a guy who looks like a kid trick-or-treating. But that's not to say the game's lazy or anything, because the graphical style actually adds a lot of charm. It's a pretty straightforward game that's kinda difficult, plenty of fun, and while it was never released in North America, there's really not a whole lot of text it needs translating. Nintendo's probably not gonna pay money to translate it themselves, but I dare say that it'd be worth it, because it's not like Namco's punk asses are doing anything with it anyway. Number 8. Sweet Home. I've talked about this game before, but this is pretty much what started the survival horror genre, and it's actually what eventually became Resident Evil. It was made by Capcom in 1989, and it was never released outside of Japan for reasons nobody really knows. Well, actually, this guy Chad who works at Food Line knows, but I'm not about to ask him, because he's a dick. The most common reasons as to why we never got this game, though, is that it was too mature for Western audiences. And since it was based on an obscure Japanese horror movie, nobody would even know what it was. But if you ask my festively plump ass, Friday the 13th seems a lot more mature. And North America was also able to get Dragon Power and Mario 2, despite their Japanese counterparts being based off TV shows we didn't know about. I'm sure those two factors didn't help, but the main reason why I don't think we got this is because it's an RPG, which was a genre that had a hard time gaining popularity outside of Japan. I mean, most gamers back then didn't really have any idea what was going on in games that weren't completely straightforward. I mean, the average person just kinda aimlessly walked around in Zelda cutting bushes. I'm not denying I wasn't in that category of gamers back then, but at least my excuse was that I was 4 years old. So don't even try blaming me for not getting Sweet Home, because I certainly played Resident Evil, you turkeys. Number 9. Ninja Rahoi. This game wouldn't make any sense, and it'd be completely out of place outside of Japan since it's a parody of their culture from the 80s and 90s. But that's actually why I think it'd be really interesting. Admittedly, I've never actually played this game, but from all the videos I've been watching, it seems like something that'd be right up my alley. The comedy gives me really strong mother vibes, and yeah, the puns probably wouldn't make much sense in English. But with an assay or creativity, I'm sure the translators could probably figure something out. Like most Famicom RPGs, it seems like there's way too many random battles, which might turn casuals off. But I still think this game would go a long way to please the people who think they've seen everything. Number 10. Digital Devil Monogatari Megami Tensei 2.
Can't understand a word of it.
Out of all the games on this list, this is the one I personally want more than anything else. Most people have no idea what it is, which hurts the chances of us getting it almost as much as the fact that Nintendo doesn't own it. But unlike the rest of this list, this game doesn't even have a fan translation. For some odd reason, nobody seems to feel like translating this, and I know fan translations are usually done for free by Good Samaritans in their spare time. But like, seriously, why has nobody translated this yet? To me, the weirdest part about all this is that someone actually did start translating it and you could play the game up to a certain point. But then whoever was doing it had to take a dump or something, and I guess they just forgot about it. The first game already has a full translation, which I'd also love to see get an official release, but since we could already play that, it's not really that big of a deal to me. But if Nintendo really wants to woo their fans with the Switch's online service, then I think they need to find someone who's not taking a dump and get them to translate this game. Given that the Megami Tensei series is more popular than ever, you'd think Atlus would have translated and sold this game themselves. Or I mean, at least pay one of their fans to do it for them for like $100. But I guess they're probably too embarrassed to show off their early work. Whether it be from Atlus, Nintendo, or somebody who's not taking a dump, I'm hopeful we see this in English sooner than later. If Nintendo were to do it themselves, though, I think they'd get a lot of goodwill for their online service. Number 11. Earthbound Beginnings. This is by far the most obvious game for Nintendo to toss in the mix. It's not going to get duked on in the trailer's YouTube video. It's already translated and ready to go, they own the rights to it, it's not on the NES Classic Edition, and when they released it on the Wii U, Mother fans rejoiced all over the world. And then they wanted Mother 3 more than ever, which probably won't happen, but hey, they were initially happy nonetheless. The biggest problem with this game getting a release 2 decades after it was translated is that it was released on the Wii U of all things. Not the Wii, not even the 3DS, but the friggin' Wii U. Technically it's better than nothing, but really not by much. It's kinda like Nintendo doesn't even want English speakers to play this series. I mean, Nintendo treats Mother 1 like I treat my step-uncle Lonnie. My friends might all think he's a fun guy, but I just plain don't like him. So when I'm encouraged to invite him to my Christmas party, I make sure to use words in the email to make sure it goes to the spam folder. Mother 1's not the greatest game in the world. In fact, the average person probably wouldn't even like it. But there's only 3 Mother games in existence, and there's never ever gonna be another one. So if Nintendo hates being pestered by Mother fans as much as it seems like they do, then I have no idea why they wouldn't just release every game in the series and be done with it. Especially the first one, since the Wii U version barely even counts. If anything, the fact that they've already given it to us and people still weren't able to play it probably makes people want it that much more. And since people are only subscribing to the Switch's online service to play games like Smash and Mario Maker online, adding it to the NES library would be pretty much seen as a sweet bonus. Or at the very least a worthy addition for $20 a year. All I know is that Nintendo rarely and lazily copying and pasting 30-year-old games the way that they are certainly isn't helping anybody. It's not that the games are necessarily bad, it's just that we've all played them 1,000 times already. It feels like they're turning the NES into a zombie, which is really unfortunate because they could be bringing it back to life outside of Japan by adding games that probably would have failed back in the day, but the majority of the fan base is a lot more willing to play now, especially if it's seen as a bonus perk. It's not even like there's a small handful of games they could put on the service either. There's plenty of hidden gems in North America, and the Famicom had hundreds of games that never left Japan. I know most of those games were shovelware, but a lot of them were actually pretty good, or at the very least interesting. I'm not sure if these games could actually save the Switch's online service for everybody, but there's definitely a lot of games Nintendo could shock us with. And most importantly of all, they're totally capable of making it happen. It would require a little bit of effort to translate games and stuff like that, but doing so would get people buzzing and talking about what might possibly come out next. And I'm pretty sure Nintendo would prefer that over their YouTube videos being disliked into oblivion. But if the Switch's NES games could have real-life human beings, then the 2 best additions would be today's patrons of the day, John Polish Impossible to Say and Hedge Knight Mike. If you want to be a badass like these two, then consider supporting FU Game Crew on Patreon for loot boxes and silly rewards. That way I could give paying child support the old college try. Or if you want to make cameos, then send us pictures of videos of you rocking anything from the merch store like these sexy BCC before you. What do you think would salvage the Switch's NES library though? Are there any games that I missed, or is there literally nothing that could justify $20 a year? Either way, let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody. What do you think would salvage the Switch's NES library, though? Are there any games that I missed, or is there literally nothing that could justify $20 a year? But while you're here, make sure to share this video anywhere you think people are going to have something to say about it, and if you want to prove you're not a registered sex offender, then press the subscribe button if you haven't already. My name's Cameron, and I'll see you next time.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.